Hello there, friend, and welcome back to the Doing What Matters podcast. I'm your host, Teresa McCloy, and this episode is going to be a great episode. Grab you a cup of coffee, a cup of hot tea, whatever it might be, and just really focus in as I have a wonderful conversation with Jay and Rebecca Madden. I think Jay and Rebecca and I are going to be good friends as we know so many of the same people and have so many similar threads in our story. They're going to be sharing about their brand new book that just came out at the end of last year called Breathless Haste: Finding God in Ordinary Life. And this book was published with Hope Books, and it is just a beautiful book. What Jay and Rebecca have done is really just share stories from their journals back and forth of their everyday ordinary life. And if you have followed along with me for a while, you know that I love everyday life stories where God is moving in extraordinary ways. In this year, it's been the best book I've read so far. And I think it's just because of the writing style, because of the simplicity, but yet the true transparency of their story and how God was moving in it. Make sure you pick up a copy of Breathless Haste and enjoy this episode of the conversation with Jay and Rebecca. You can find their book at so many places. You can go to all of your favorite book retailers and find it there, or you can go to their website at findinggodtoday.com. You'll even be able to get some free resources and downloads as well. We'll have all those links in the show notes. Let's dive right into the conversation. Enjoy listening in. Jay and Rebecca, welcome to the Doing What Matters podcast. It is so great to have you here. I have been deeply in your book, and I want to talk about your book and explore the book and even some of the story behind the book. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. We're so delighted to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having us.
It's going to be a fun conversation. So, as I said in the intro, when I was introducing Jay and Rebecca, they have a brand new book out that's only been out a few months called Breathless Haste. And if one of you, would you just share? We were talking before we hit record, just this everyday, ordinary life story stuff. Just give us an overall of the book and where it's taking us and what the reader might experience when they dive into this book.
In the book, we just share 30 different stories of how we found God, experienced God, heard from Him over the course of about 25 or 30 years. And these stories came from our journals. Jay and I became journalers a long time ago. Not obviously, we don't journal together, but we journal separately. And then along the way, we just would share some of our stories of what we talk about in the book, and people would just say, you need to write a book. You need to write a book along the way. And we just ignored them for a really long time. And so finally, during the process of COVID and empty nesting, we decided it was time to write the book. So we just started thinking through what were the best of stories, not necessarily the miraculous necessarily, but some of the mundane and ordinary, and just hearing from God in spaces like nature, the still small voice, music, poems, just all kinds of things along the way. So it's just our evidence of God's work in our lives. So
That's beautiful. Jay, when you all first started working on the book together, was this what do I want to say, joint, like, oh, we're both all in, or was there resistance from one of you or the other? Because I can't imagine writing a book together as a couple.
Yeah. So the way it worked is Rebecca had really been thinking about writing this book for a while, and she had actually started writing some of the stories down, and she was visiting her mother, who was in her 90s at the time and couldn't really see anymore. And So Rebecca crawled up into bed with her and said, "Hey, I'm going to read you a little bit of what I've written." And then her mom said, "Is Jay writing his stories?" And Rebecca said, "No, he's not." And she goes, "I think he should." And so then Rebecca came home and shared that with me and said, "You know what? I think we should write this book together." And I was pretty resistant. I said, "This is your book." I had just finished a dissertation, so writing something was the last thing I wanted to do. And but she's quite persuasive, and then I warmed up to it, and then as we started doing it, it just really wove together, and it's really been a great experience for us. It's really connected us in a new way and just reminded us of a lot of things that we had either forgotten or just put on the shelf that God did in and through us. So it's
Mm.
been
Mhm.
I love that, how it was just even one more nudge, right? Of just like, okay, now we have a whole nother story of the story of writing the book. And the book is beautiful. It really is, and how it goes back and forth, and how we hear from you, Rebecca, and then we hear from Jay, and just this journey. But as I know, when I was writing my book back in 20 and 21, in the same time period, mine came out in 22. So just a year ahead of yours here. It is interesting. And maybe you want to say something about that, of going back and looking at those stories and seeing the threads and seeing God. What was that experience like as you even went back? And one of our good friends, Sybil Towner, often uses that word remember, and just that deep meaning of that word remembering. What was that like? What was that experience like for you all?
Yeah, it was, parts of it were hard. I shed some tears. I think the thing that was probably most interesting to me and the remembering thing is, like, there were things we noticed in writing the book and going back and reading our journals that we had never noticed before. And we thought we knew our story backwards and forwards. And then as you go
Yeah,
back,
you lived it, right? But yet there was more there.
yeah, as you go back with time, and you go, wow, I had not really thought of that way, but now I see something fresh and new. It just, I don't know, it just built our faith all over again, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah. How about for you, Rebecca, as you think back on that season?
Yeah. One of the interesting things was, like, a lot of this, if we didn't have our journals, there would not be a book. Literally, there was so much detail in our journals that I think we would have second guessed ourselves
Mhm.
had we not had the journals, trying to put these stories back together. But we would come together and I would be like, wait a minute, I have that same thing in my journal. I don't even remember that. And he's like, I had it in my journal too. And so it was just like this concrete evidence of how God really did work in this story or in this situation. And we would just mutually confirm for one another, yes, that's what I have. That's also what I remembered. So that we were really giving this very truthful evidence of God's work. And so being able to look at it in a big picture instead of just one story at a time, just confirmed how God literally has been at work for years and years. And one thing has built upon another in our lives. And it's just a beautiful thing to look back over the whole of the story and not just the parts of the story.
Mm. So I have a couple of places I want to go into this conversation. One you just mentioned was journaling. And so I do want to come back around and talk just about some practical practices in life. But before we go there, I want to explore the title of the book, and
Yes.
just how did that title come to be? Because as someone who just recently went through the same process that you have, of writing a book and then picking the stories that you will share, what you won't share, because I think that's part of the journey too, is there are some things that are just so personal
Mhm.
that you're like, I don't think that belongs. We don't always share it all, especially in hard stories. But there's also a part of then you get to the kind of the part of the book that's just this, okay, we got to choose a title, we got to choose a cover, we got to do all these things. Where does breathless haste come from?
Really interesting. So I was meeting with a spiritual director in Chicago, and Jay, we had been in Chicago at this point about 6 years, and Jay was feeling really restless about his work. And he was thinking that the time was coming that he might need to take another step from where we were to the next step. And I met with this woman and I just said, we don't really know what's next. We don't know what's happening. We don't know really where we are in this whole process. And she just casually leaned back and she got a Bible and she opened it up to Habakkuk 2. And she started reading it, and she gets to a point in the language, and she uses, and it had the term breathless haste in the scripture. And I was like, breathless haste? Wow, that's how we came to Chicago. Is that how we're going to leave? And I don't think she answered the question. I think this was just like me having this rhetorical question in my spirit about what is this? And it did happen that God used that term, and we really did end up leaving in breathless haste from Chicago, just like we had left with breathless haste from Greenville. And when we were in the midst of this whole book, we didn't have a title. And one day Jay and I are walking, and I'm like, what are we going to call this book? And we're like back and forth, we don't know. And then he just all of a sudden goes, breathless haste. And I was like, I have chill bumps just saying that. So that's how it came about. Do you remember that walk?
Oh yeah. I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's
It fits the book so well because I hear that thread in the story even as I'm reading of these times. And I think for those of you that are listening that pick up this book, again, going to highly recommend it. I think that's something that many of us have experienced in our lives of we're discerning or we're deciding. And I always have these conversations of the difference between deciding is where you're going for lunch, right? And discerning is a whole different process.
Yeah.
And we feel like we're in this long discernment. And then all of a sudden it just is, whoa, it's happening tomorrow. Or we have to make this decision that feels like we're in haste and we're out of breath and all these things. But Jay, would you explore for us just a minute? Because I know this scripture does come up several times throughout the book in different ways and parts. And you even end the book by taking this passage apart, so to speak, and just writing through it. This Habakkuk 2, 1 and 4. Tell me what your thoughts are and why that scripture just stands out for the both of you.
Yeah. Like most people, I haven't spent a lot of time in Habakkuk. Like,
I
and
don't know why, Jay.
it's not like one of the go-tos. And this phrasing caught our attention from the version that she gave us. But the whole idea is that he's standing on this watchtower waiting for a vision from God. And then when it comes, it'll come with breathless haste and there'll be no time to linger. That's the way it reads. And so there's a lot in there. I think about, if you think about discernment and you think of the idea that we need to wait, but then also what's our posture while we're waiting? And that's one of the things I think we talked about in the epilogue of it's not passive waiting, it's active waiting. And because you have to have the correct posture so that when you do get the word from God or you feel like you've discerned your next steps, you have to be ready to go. Mm-hmm. And because I think often we can feel like I'm either trying to make it happen all on my own, or I'm just going to sit back and wait and God's going to do it. And I think life with God is a mutual process. And so I just thought there was a lot in that verse about waiting, but waiting with a posture where you're participating with God and you're ready to move when you feel like you have clarity. And it talks a lot about faithfulness too. And I think that God is faithful, and then we have to also be faithful to follow him.
So you said something I think pretty profound right there in the in that waiting of discernment. And throughout the book, you all share so many stories where you're waiting and you're discerning, but yet there's two choices, right? We can either wait and go, okay, God, I'm sitting back and I'm passive and I'm just waiting for. Rebecca would talk many times in the book of, I need the sign, I need the, like, give me the billboard, right? All the things. Or we're trying to do it on our own. And I think what you just said, Jay, is somewhere in there, there's a middle. At least that's been my experience in my own story of really hard things. When, and you all may or may not know my story, but when our son was in the worst of his addictions, and I felt like I was in, my husband, I felt like we were in just this long, horrible waiting season and not knowing what to do and where to turn. But yet, and I think you all discovered that, I discovered that in the everyday, ordinary days of life is what I call them. I love the message version of Romans 12:1 and 2. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your eating, sleeping, walking around life, and place that before God as an offering. That's my life verse. And it became my life verse when all of a sudden we're in places, as you guys have talked about, and I've talked about in my story, where we can't foresee the future very far ahead. We really just have to live in the day.
Yeah.
And as we live in that day, that's where these practices, okay, I have to form a rule of life that just keeps me right here. That's what I see in you guys' story, is that middle of I'm waiting, but it's not passive.
I, I think like somewhere someone described it to me as you're holding it loosely, whatever it is. And so if you're trying to discern, are you going to make a career change, for instance? You can't be like, I'm holding on to what I have now and I'm not gonna make a change. But you also can't be like, I'm leaving right now no matter what. You have to hold on to it loose until you have enough clarity to really feel like, okay, I feel like God has given me the next step. Yeah.
So before we go to how do we live in that middle, Rebecca, as you think, even from the book, just to give people a little bit of taste, is there a story that you share in the book that you wouldn't mind sharing with us of just this? Yeah, I am in this place of I'm holding it loosely and not knowing. And yeah, and it comes with a breathless haste and we got to move, or we know that it's very clear. Would you mind sharing just a story with us from there?
Yeah, the story that pops to my mind is really probably I was holding tightly and how God loosened my grip. Jay was trying to discern if he wanted to do an internship in Chicago. This is when he's in his 40s, so this isn't out of college type situation. It's we've got children, we're settled, we love where we live, we've got great friends, great church, great family. And he is trying to decide about potentially doing an internship in Chicago. And I just kind of lost it. I was like, no, we are absolutely not going there. And you need to check out all the seminaries and all the options in the South and right around Greenville. I want to be here. And I just said, if you can't find anything in the next 6 months, then I'll consider the Chicago option, but I'm not going to turn my life upside down for this. And he was going on his annual duck hunt in January of this year, not this year, but a number of years ago. And I woke up at 4:30 in the morning, looked at the digital clock next to me, the old brown plastic thing that we used to have.
Mhm.
And my kids were small and it was just kind of weird to wake up at that time. And I just was like, that's weird. And I just went back to sleep. And then on the second night, he was still gone. And I woke up and looked at the clock and it was 4:30 again, not 4:32, 4:25. It was literally 4:30. And I was like, gosh, that's so weird. And I went back to sleep again. And then the third morning, I woke up again and it was 4:30 and I was like, okay, God, what is it? And I was very irreverent about it. I got out of bed and I had Power of a Praying Wife on my chair. I had not prayed it daily, but I had prayed it a good bit. And it was just happened to be open to chapter 9 in that book. And chapter 9 happened to be on his purpose. And it went on to say that when your husband finds his calling and his purpose, then you will find fulfillment. And it just went on and on. And I literally, my tears started turning into sobbing. And through that chapter, it was not an audible voice, but I felt like God took a Sharpie marker and he just wrote, "Go to Chicago" on the pages.
Mm.
And a few months later, we had gone to Chicago, packed our bags, put a for sale and a for lease sign in front of our house, and took the trip to Chicago.
Wow. Yeah.
And amazingly enough, when I look back on my life, I think that point in time and that part of our lives is going to be one of the best things I ever did.
Mm.
But I had to not hold tightly. I was holding tightly to South Carolina. I had to let go of South Carolina and let go of my family and my friends and our church to go to what God really had for us, which then led to our future work.
And I
I
remember,
l-
and
Go
I
ahead,
remember,
Jay.
and I was just to say, I so remember that because when I left on my trip, Rebecca had said, "We're not doing that." And I was like, okay. And I left and called her a couple of days later. And we had terrible cell service where I was. And I can remember the spot I was standing in at night and go, "Oh, I'm going to call and check in." And I'm like, "Hey, how's it going?" And she's, "I've been thinking that we need to go to Chicago and check that thing out." And it actually scared me because I was like, "Oh, this is real. Like God is up to something here."
Mm.
Because not only has he been nudging me, but now without me being involved at all, Rebecca's had this total 180. And so that was a powerful time.
Wow. I just literally read that chapter last night. And so just hearing you describe it, I'm like, wow, I just remember reading that. And yet hearing you talk about it, I also hear the connection of paying attention. Okay, 3 times. You and Peter. I always say God has to get my attention too in such crazy ways. I'm like Peter, like, okay, this is number 3. But yet you saw it as kind of a sign from God. Okay, it's happened. Whereas I think when you take a posture of awareness, and whether you know that now or you remember it now looking back, that's a presence that you were taking of, okay, I need to pay attention. And I feel like so many times we can get stuck in a rut of living our lives with our spiritual eyes closed to those everyday, ordinary, I call them extraordinary moments that God has that are actually what is moving and growing our faith. And actually they're the discernment sign, the big bright billboard and arrow that we're looking for. And we think it's going to come in some other way. And it comes with 3 days in a row waking up at 4:30 in the morning. And yeah, so great example of just how God is moving in the middle of us either trying to do it or we're waiting on him. But let's shift a little bit. I'd love to talk about, you mentioned journaling, and I actually got to hear you share with our community a few weeks back just about this practice of journaling. A common thread that Rebecca and I now have that's beautiful is we are both connected to this beautiful tool of Listen to My Life with One Life Maps. And Rebecca was a part of that. And someday I'm going to go offline with Rebecca and we're going to just talk history of the maps because I want to hear more and more. But I have heard my dear friend Sybil talk about Rebecca for years, and just Rebecca Madden was a part of this beginning, and Rebecca Madden was the third one that was with us on this journey. So that's a story for another day that we'll explore. But when we had you and Jay both on to talk to our Life Maps community about journaling. That is one of many spiritual practices, if you want to call them, that I would imagine that you guys implemented and had going on in your lives as you walk through. Would you expand a little bit more on maybe what are two or three that you, besides journaling, that maybe Jay, you could share one, Rebecca could share one, and just that you implemented into your life during this journey of living really in breathless haste? What's next? But yet it helped you stay grounded, because I think that's what practices do.
Yeah. During that time was the first time I really tried like solitude, like for any given time. And I was in a very fast-paced ministry environment. For part of that time, I had been going to seminary at the same time, and just a very full and crazy life.
Not to mention children and a wife.
Not to mention children and a wife. And so I just found that, like, I know the quiet time is the go-to for us, but I just have a hard time like quieting my mind in
Thank you for being honest.
and so I just tried, I'm going to go away. There was someone who had a house out near a lake, and they would let people use it, and I would go out there by myself and spend a day. And that was the first time I had done anything like that. And so I started doing things like that, and I would just go out there and be quiet and try to hear God and journal and take a nap and read. And like, it was a very unplanned, free flowing time. But every time I did that, like, I heard from God in some way. There was something, and I was like, oh, that piece of scripture jumped off the page, or I connected the dots of something in my journal. I created a little bit of a habit of, I like to go back and read my journals back. And because I think then you see where there are things that, wow, God really answered that prayer, and I'd actually even forgot about it. And so it was just that practice of finding solitude, and and whether it was a day, or there were some occasions where I did more than a day when schedule allowed, but I think those were very important during that time to just help me to just slow down, listen, just be with him, and be able to try to hear his voice a little bit.
I do appreciate your honesty of it's not easy. I share a story in my book. Probably a mutual friend of ours, Rory Noland, was my first spiritual director. I didn't even know that's what he was. I hired him because I was a worship minister and he was a worship minister, and he had a mentoring program. And he sat me, I remember I locked myself in the nursing mother's room at the church I was working with, because that was the quietest place, like during the week, where you could get away. There was no windows, just a rocking chair. And I'm in there, and Rory says, I really want you to start like just sitting quiet for 5 minutes. And much like Peter and your 4:30 in the morning, I said, and do what? He goes, no, like just sit. And I go, and I did. I asked 3 times, what do you, because I'm a doer. I'm a type 3 on the Enneagram. I lived my life in workaholism. That was my escape. That was my fast paced. I created the fast pace. And I just remember, to this day, solitude for me is more that getting away. I still might be doing something, if that makes sense. I'm not good at sitting palms up, totally quiet, meditative. That's just not my style. And I think it's good for people to hear that solitude can look different depending on who you are. I love going to the Springs, where Dick and Sybil Towner have their retreat center, and being in the Hermitage and all of that. But most of the time I'm walking, or I'm taking a nap, or all the things that that we can give our bodies permission to do in those times of solitude. So appreciate your honesty to say it can look different for everybody. How about you, Rebecca? What are some practices that you saw that carried you through in this in between?
Mhm. I had never heard the term spiritual practice or anything like that until I got to Chicago. I was at a women's retreat. Sybil was one of the teachers along the way, but someone else was teaching on solitude and silence. And I was like, I don't even what? And I just something struck in me because I sound like I'm a lot like you. I'm a very doer, get it done, move out of my way kind of person. And I decided at that retreat that I would start taking from 9 to 2 while my kids were in school, one day a month. And I would just walk. We ended up moving to Algonquin when we moved up there, and they had this beautiful trail all throughout the neighborhood around lakes. And I would just go out there by myself and walk. I would take naps and I would journal. And those were the main things I did. And that practice, I think, was life-changing for lots of reasons. I think it just helped me to realize that I don't have to work 7 days a week to prove myself. And so that just helped me for so many reasons to think about our lives and to think about who I was and who I wasn't and who God was and that he was in control and stuff like that. So that was definitely the longest practice that I've done. And now we Sabbath more one day a week, but we weren't really Sabbathing during this time that we wrote the book, but kind of switch it up depending on the season of life we're in.
If you're listening and you're familiar with past podcasts or past things, you're hearing a theme here because this is something we talk about in the process that I teach, is this idea of getting up on the balcony of your life on a regular basis. I don't think there's anything more impactful. I'm the same than as I was introduced to spiritual practices actually through the Transforming Center with Ruth Haley Barton. And I always say I had to go through it twice because I was so new to all of that way. That wasn't how I had practiced my faith up until that time. And that idea of on a regular basis, I often share with people if once every 3 months, you can take a 24-hour period to get up on the balcony. You heard Rebecca say she does it monthly. And so for those of you who might be young moms or in a different season of life that you say, hey, I can take this time while my kids are at school. The other thing I hear there, Rebecca, is you made a choice to do it differently. And talk to me, both of you, about that idea of, I think sometimes we think we don't have a choice to make the shift in our lives. We're begging for it. We're craving for it. I work with a lot of business owners and people that I say, the phrase I use is we're living with our hair on fire. When we're just in that season and we feel like we're up against a wall of there's no choice to do it different. And I was reading your book. I felt like there were so many times that you all, whether it was a move you made or whatever, you literally made a choice. When you think about that word, how does that sit for you of, yeah, I could do it different. I could live life in a different rhythm and routine. Jay, what comes up for you when you think about living differently?
I was just thinking about, I just preached a couple of weeks ago on Sabbath, and one of the things that we have a super busy congregation here, and I think I said that we're not really the victim of our busyness, but we're the author of our busyness.
Amen.
And there's definitely folks that they have a life that they're covered up with, with so many things, and it's very hard to find any space to do anything. But I think for a lot of us, we're mostly busy with things we've chosen to do. And so I think it's a matter of us really making some choices and believing that all time is God's time. And if I create this space, that I'm not going to miss out on something better, or I'm not going to fall behind, that it's really going to be worth it. And so I think that would be my thing, is take control of this, not see busyness as just something I'm a victim of, but how to
Right.
really make choices to live differently.
And it might not happen overnight, right? It's
Um,
small incremental steps over time. I had a client ask me recently, like, how long did it take you to,
yeah.
and because we all want the quick fix, right? We want the whatever. And I said 2 to 3 years to really reshape, to add in a Sabbath day, to get to a place where I had a day of what I call renewal. I think that's the sustainability piece, is to sustain life, to see the everyday moments, to walk in it as you guys write about in your book. It is changing some behaviors, some rhythms in our lives. So to me, spiritual practices that you guys have even talked about are about choosing to bring those in, which means if we put something in, something else is needing to be set aside. So what about for you, Rebecca, when you think of choosing to live it differently and to add in the day that you did?
Yeah. As I was telling her, we were in a group the other night and I said, most of us aren't going to starve to death if we take a day off of work. Like, it's one thing if you're a single mom and you have 2 jobs and all this, but most of the people that we are in church with don't have that situation, and that we're so exhausted. We cannot live out of that exhausted state. We can't feel and experience our life as it is because we're so tired. And I would work myself to death, literally, if I just chose my path.
New
Sometimes
friend.
he has to look at me and go,
We can start a club, Rebecca. We can.
he has to go, enough already. Because I now added the book on top of my regular job. So he has to do that more often. But you have to choose, and you can't really live your life at living on fumes all the time, because then you don't experience the love and the joy and the peace that is being given to us, because we can't even take it in because we're too tired.
Mm.
And so it is a hard choice. It is hard to Sabbath. It is hard to take solitude and silence, but the benefit of it is amazing. I was just at a silent retreat recently. Our staff took a silent retreat, which was really awesome. And I slept for 10 hours the first night. I just got in the bed because I didn't have the TV. I was just, and slept for 10 hours. And I was like, I cannot remember the last time I slept for 10 hours. My body needed this.
Yes.
So you have to make a choice to shut it down. And as I said recently, and I said, you have to turn off that productivity switch.
Yeah. No.
Because I think when you do, you are able to have a more productive, more life sustaining work. You come up with new ideas when you walk. There's just the resetting is just,
Well, it was like when Jay was talking about solitude and silence and going away for that day. I often find, because when I first started practicing those types of things, I was expecting some lightning bolt to come. Oh, at 2 p.m., I got the sign from God of whatever I was discerning or whatever I was doing. And it's much sitting with a spiritual director or a coach or someone that you've brought into your team, so to speak, that's listening to your life story. It's not always in that moment that you have the big aha or that God speaks. It's in the regular rhythm and practice of, or it's 3 weeks later when you go, oh, when I was thinking about that, those to me become the connecting dots in our story, is all of those times when we practice, whether it's journaling, whether it's silence and solitude, whatever is practicing Sabbath, whatever those things might be, they become the dots where we look back. Your book would have never come to pass had you not practiced the journaling, and then the impact that it will have. I know it's impacted me, just in these are real people doing real life with real heartaches and real things. And as we were talking before we recorded, I think people need to hear those stories that there's real things.
Mhm.
So thank you both for just being so transparent to share your story on paper. I know the feeling of, I can't take that back now. It's written in black and white. So
Forever with our names associated.
forever with your names and a date and a time and all of that. And I will encourage you. The beauty is what will come out of this book. I have been blown away with sharing my own story, and I think you all will be too, of just all the people's lives that it will touch, all the encouragement that it will give. Yeah, just some handles for some people to say, okay, me too. And if they've been there, I can too. And you probably already have experienced it. Someone finds your book and you're like, how did you find it? And I had someone find mine in the library in Oklahoma. And I'm like, what was it doing in the library in Oklahoma? And sends me the most heartfelt email. And those are the moments that you're like, okay, God, thank you for showing us the way to get this book in print. So thank you for writing the book and for being a light for that place and for being on the podcast today. Yeah, further conversations to come, there is no doubt. But thank you both for being a guest.
Thank you so much for having us. It was a joy.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks so much.
What a beautiful conversation that was with Jay and Rebecca. Thanks so much for listening in. As I said, I encourage you after listening to this episode to pick up Breathless Haste and just put it into your reading list. Dive into the stories that Jay and Rebecca share. I think you will find your threads also inside of their threads and their stories. What a joy it was to have them. And don't forget to go to their website, findinggodtoday.com, and download some of the free resources they have and just begin to get connected with these beautiful people and the way that they are shining the light out into the world. And remember that every ordinary day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for them. I'll see you next week, friend, here on the Doing What Matters podcast.